And with that, it is a brand new episode of Not Playing Politics with Alexander Keaton and my Rio, Nick Bradshaw. Nick, how you doing? Hello? Nick, can you hear me?
I got you. There we are.
There we are. The gremlins got you, huh?
It's rather ironic that the topic to discuss today is the media, and in our attempt to get the technology up to discuss the media, we found ourselves with a little bit of hiccup. So, problem solved. That way, we know that this is genuine. This is a real show being produced.
Yep. Well, let's like you said, there is some irony there. I mean, if I was more conspiratorially, inclined, I may think that someone was playing with it. But no, I'm well aware that it's just us. This is just how we roll. So it's been an interesting week. Like I said, we want to talk about media, more specifically media manipulation, because there's a lot going on, and people don't even, again, like fish in a water, right? It's like, do fish understand that they're wet? Kind of a thing. Like, I think we often don't understand how our media doesn't actually report news. They create narratives that they feed us, and they manipulate us to change how we feel, how we vote, how we think, how we feel about people of other genders, other religions, other skin colors. It's all manipulation. But this week has been sort of a really interesting sort of setup for that. Nick, you really have some credibility here. Let's start with Flynn, right? What we've been learning this week with the document drops. Uh, what was the most startling thing for you on with these revelations?
Well, I think, back to your point about how, there's influence, or I think, maybe the word manipulation was used. What I would be careful to say is that from a 30,000 foot view, I think number one, the media can't control what you think. I don't believe that. I do think that if you look at some of the mass communication studies done, decades ago, actually in the early parts of the early to mid 20th century, you could uncover that some of the philosophies that were present at the time with regard to propaganda and different channels that were used in government and powers of the such. What really became apparent was that the media can't tell you what to think, but they can certainly provide a lens through which those in the audience are focused on what to think about. A good example I can give you about that is everybody knew that the Kavanaugh case was the center of the universe.
Right.
Everybody knew that Stormy Daniels was the center of the universe. Without undercutting what we're talking about today with regard to General Michael Flynn and Tara Reade and different stories like that, these are simply the big things now. And that kind of process, sometimes referred to as agenda setting or framing theory, talks about how we focus on these stories. I mean, of the 10,000 news stories that are taking place all over the world, we're talking about the same 5. And those 5 kind of go about with our attention on them almost exclusively. For the first time in weeks, COVID, which is still very present in the news, has not been to the same degree that it's been recently. So that to me is really where the influence comes in, is not so much in, you watch a show and say, well, never mind, I don't know what I think, I'm just some drone and this is what I'm going to do. But rather it frames what we're talking about. We opened up today's show with regard to General Michael Flynn and the document drop and things like that, because that's what's being pushed right now. Michael Flynn, of course, the shortly and briefly lived national security advisor to President Trump, was taken out of that position fairly early on in the administration, and tangentially has remained in the news, but nowhere near where he is now, where he's being, the DOJ is dropping charges and people are going on, and now you have former presidents that are saying that this is the rule of law itself is at risk. So to address the question more directly, what I would say is this is the hot button item for this week, and it may last a couple weeks, but we'll see. The question that I think is raised that really is fascinating is, how did it get to this point? How did it get to the point that the 3-star general in the Army, who, from what other media scholars and legal professionals would say, violated no law? We can talk about optics all day, but violated no law. They were removed from the position of National Security Advisor, put up against hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of penalties, fines, and fees, and potentially looking at jail time, imprisonment, only to have documents come out now to say the very people that were chirping for his head on a plate couldn't find credible evidence to levy against him. And so again, that goes back to my original point. It can't tell you what to think, but it can sure tell you what to think about. The story about General Flynn focused exclusively, in my opinion, almost on his guilt from the beginning. There was almost no presumption of innocence. It was just, you're guilty until you find a way to show us you're not. And I think that's the most dangerous thing that we're facing right now.
So how specifically with Flynn, though, because I completely agree, they're not controlling the mind. But if the media comes to us, right, and they put the focus on something, but then they start deliberately omitting information.
Sure.
They deliberately omit context.
Mm-hmm.
They deliberately omit exculpatory evidence.
Right.
How does that not calculate into manipulation?
Well, I mean, the concept of fake news, right? When the president says it, I think there's more of a visceral, oh, you're a faker, you're a phony. For me, the term fake news has always applied more to a much more deliberate intent. It wasn't like, oops, we forgot this, but more so a deliberate attempt to frame a narrative, right? And right. I think where you see some of that taking place is actually at the higher levels. What I mean by that is when you have news agencies that are owned by media conglomerates, the days of Walter Cronkite in a NewsHour or Bill Paley at CBS News or people that you had to, your Edward R. Murrows, if you will, or people, they had shows that were sponsored. They had things that were going on. Okay, we have to pay to keep the lights on. But I think you've got a lot of influence coming from big business. News is infotainment now. I mean, they present it as such. You watch a news broadcast today and the opening credits look like you're watching the halftime show at the Super Bowl. So it's become a product that's marketable. So how does this happen? Well, let's use Flynn specifically. Documents that were finally declassified unwillingly from some demonstrated that when under oath and in classified briefings and investigations and investigations going on at the highest levels, people's private comments contradict, or at least appear to contradict, their public comments. I mean, this was, if you recall, shortly after this time period or in and around this time period, the same thing happened to, at that time, Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Again, it was that spooling up of just so much momentum that I think things got in the way. Now, tactically, how was it done? Well, we've seen leaking coming out of this process, whether it's government itself or through the news media or whatnot, because I think we've also kind of created a platform that we idealize people for doing that, because it inherently carries with it this noble cause, that what they're doing is always for the good. Unfortunately, sometimes I think leaking itself frames a narrative. Right. You don't even have to say anything. You can just put something else out there. I mean, there are, again, back to the general, as I understand it, and I'm not exposed to news at this time that contradicts this directly, there was no official law edict that was broken. We can talk about optics till the cows come home. That's a good conversation to have. Coulda, shoulda, woulda all day. But was a law violated? And I think to be able to show that you can take down a 3-star general who's the appointed National Security Advisor based off of baseless allegations, that's a terrifying thing. The media, I think, served a role in that, and I'm not taking sides in either direction, but I think what the media did is purely through the process of amplification. It put it in front of you. For the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the most popular name spoken other than Donald Trump was Robert Mueller.
Right.
Who now people are coming out against and saying, questioning his mental capacity. Stories coming out about his legal abilities. Where was all of this at the time? And I think that's the danger that we face, is you now can use the media. I'd leave it like this. I don't know that people trust the media. That's not me trying to be some hardcore or anti-media guy. I'm saying I don't know that people trust the media, but I do think people use the media, and they use it a lot, for better or worse. And sometimes to get your information, it's hard when you go to pick up a news story and there's 700 versions of the news story. If you read a Yahoo News coverage versus Fox News versus the New York Times, are you going to get the same kind of leads? You can read how they're presented. They're saying similar things, but they're framed very differently. And that's because news in the clickbait age, in my opinion, has become almost entirely op-ed.
And it's not just how a story is presented, though. It's even the job, presumably. I think the assumption everyone works with is there is a reporter who is looking at a story. They're supposed to ask questions. They're not supposed to just take what's given. They're supposed to not just frame it appropriately, put it in its appropriate context, but they're also supposed to push back against what they're being told. And it seems like they look at things and say, okay, we're going to take all of this at face value. They're not just omitting context and exculpatory or evidence that they are, but they're also just there's zero pushback on some of these things. There's zero questioning about particular narratives, right? I think probably a great example of that is the whole Tara Reade situation, which cannot be properly discussed without juxtaposing it with the Brett Kavanaugh situation.
Exactly.
With Brett Kavanaugh, what we had was a man who was accused of an assault 40 years ago. Okay? It's the Supreme Court. This is a big deal. What she brings to the table, though, is she doesn't remember when, she doesn't remember where. She says that that there were witnesses. She names the witnesses. The witnesses, every single one of them, including one who's supposed to be a good friend of hers, says that it didn't happen. No one recalls her speaking about this particular assault contemporaneously. And she is someone who is of an who is very radical in her opposition and her, from a political party standpoint. At no point did the media ever really question her story. And even despite the fact that there were changes that happened to her story, there was never any pushback. It was, you have to accept this at face value. And it's not just accepted at face value. It's accepted at face value, and you can't question it. It cannot be. You can't question whether or not she got. Maybe it's a wrong. Maybe the event happened, but someone else. Maybe she's making this up. Maybe she completely misunderstood. You couldn't even push back on any of it. You were assaulted for doing so. It's like you were evil. You want people to you support rapists if you even question the story. Well, here we are. What, only a year later? And the same people looked at Tara Reade and they're like, well, we can't. How could we possibly believe this woman? This woman who not only worked for Joe Biden, but is aggressively on a part of his political party. She has contemporaneous people who she spoke with about this at the same time. She claims to have filed a report, though it does seem odd that no one seems to know where that might be. There were people who didn't witness the event, but the fact that she was moved and transferred from her position to sort of Timbuktu, there were people who were there at the time. They confirmed that. So we have, again, it's a very different, it is literally an exact opposite situation. Every detail that you would want, she has. Everything that would be like, okay, well, we can remove political bias from it. It's all there. And yet, there's nothing but pushback from the media. First, she was just flat out ignored, right? During the Kavanaugh thing, anyone could show up and be like, hey, yeah, I saw Brett Kavanaugh back in 1930, 12, and he was gang raping kittens with some aliens and Bigfoot. And everyone would be like, well, this is just another confirmation of his anti-female, anti-kitten, pro pro Sasquatch sexual tendencies. But this woman comes forward, very credible. There is reason to at least take her charges seriously. And it's, well, we can't take her. And of course, all we get is pushback from the media. All we get is, nope, you can't believe her. Again, the same Nancy Pelosi went from, you have to believe all women, to all women are liars. It's like it's that juxtaposition, not just of what's coming out of the political parties, but how the media itself is presenting them. That's extremely stunning.
Well, and I want to be careful. I want to be careful that we don't use hyperbolic language ourselves, because that's what I think we're trying to address today. And your story is funny. Your anecdotes are funny about it. You're doing it dramatically to prove a point. But what I'm getting at is, you mentioned the concept of pushing back. That's a very fascinating perspective, because this kind of combative nature, if you will, that the free press was designed to hold government in check and hold them accountable and keep the public informed so that the government can not just be running around in the dark doing what it does in places like China, Russia, and other places. But the problem that I think that we see now is it's all about who's pushing back. And I don't want to get too deep on it, but I'll give you an example. The new press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, was giving a press conference the other day, and people were calling out, like you said, I mean, it's not really questions as much as it is seeking for a quote in a story.
Right.
Is it true you enjoy selling puppies on Craigslist? Like, that's not a question. It is, but you framed it in such a way that you're going to get, a talking point or just shock. When she turned around and said, well, wait a minute, are you guys going to hold yourselves accountable? And she mentioned multiple media outlets.
Oh, absolutely.
She's looked upon as this aggressor. She's looked upon as this, hawk, and I found it funny that here she is, a younger woman who seems to be very, very quick on her feet, whether you like her or not. She has she's got a zing to her. I mean, if you watch any of the press conferences there, but it raises the other question, which is, the president, you notice, hasn't been doing necessarily as many of the Corona task force things. Those have come to wind down, and a lot of it turned into, even though it got tremendous ratings in the beginning, it turned out to be something that was basically like, the media versus Trump round 10. And it just kept going and going and going and going. And it wasn't really questions about what we were doing so much as it was, oh yeah, I know you are, but what am I? From all around, because that environment wasn't conducive to that kind of subject. So let's apply this to Tara Reade. You mentioned how Christine Blasey Ford, she couldn't find anyone to corroborate her story. Not one person would corroborate it. They found out that, things like dates were wrong. I don't mean like what color the wallpaper was. I mean like locations, dates, times, people that were present. The fundamentals of journalism, like who, what, where, why, when. You're talking about basic storylines. So where Tara Reade comes out, and again, on this show, we've worked very hard to not politicize and point fingers, but there is something taking place that I think is very interesting. Where Tara Reade, who has credible witnesses, who has corroborating evidence, who has things that are going on, where it's fascinating that she breaks the narrative in comparison to Christine Blasey Ford, who was by no means in alignment with the administration, is that Tara Reade's been a lifelong Democrat. And when she says Joe Biden should drop out, it violates the underlying narrative that's being pushed. The narrative being pushed, if you think about it, if you were going to sell the parties on a big scale, if you wanted to talk to an Italian immigrant coming to this country, learning about politics for the first time, and you needed to use bullet points to kind of steer them towards the parties, some of the talking points I think most people would agree on. Whether they personally use it or not is not what I'm making. I'm saying whether they would agree on it as a major talking point that those parties are viewed as, I would say, Democrats used to be the working man's party, the party of minorities, but also kind of the tax and spend. You know, they were the ones that had, you know, a little bit bigger expenditures and things that they wanted to do and government programs and things like that. More of a centralized power with the government, the federal government in particular. And the Republicans were more of your uppity, crusty old white guys that were very pro-business, but were also very hawkish on the military, very much about national defense, and carrying that kind of paradigm. Well, not only has the Republican and Democrat parties kind of broken up a lot of those things because they become so tribalized. Donald Trump also broke up a lot of those things. He's a populist that came in who is by no means a fiscal conservative. Before COVID, he was spending money like it was going out of style anyway. So he's by no means some fiscal conservative. But the other parties themselves, the national parties, have gone so far in these corners that I could read you a headline, and just by the way it's worded, I could tell that you would probably be able to guess not only which party is it directed at and the audience that it's addressing, but probably even the producer. You know, the concept of having litmus tests where people stand on the Second Amendment, or where people stand on abortion, or where people stand on foreign policy, or where people stand on bailouts, or whatever. I think tying it back to our topic today, it's about framing a narrative. It's about agenda setting. It's about getting those things in front of people so they can respond to it, driving a narrative. It's why 5 different media outlets cover the same story, but they're going to talk to you for 24 hours a day about it. And they're going to bring in an expert who was somebody's high school roommate's sister's best friend, college roommate's varsity track coach, because that's going to give us an insight. At the end of the day, we live in the most highly mediated world that man has ever known. We have a generation of children being raised online constantly. How many times have you heard parents, you're a parent, how many times have you heard parents say, this is the iPad babysitter? I mean, this is not something that's new or rare. We are putting media in front of people all the time, constantly. So I want to kind of come back to the barn on this one. Whether it is General Flynn, whether it's Tara Reade, whatever it is, the question that always has to be asked is cui bono, who benefits, right? Who's getting this out of here? I would say, and I think most people would agree, that the percentage of left-leaning media outlets in this country vastly supersedes that of the right. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think
Okay.
that's a that's almost self-evident. I mean, it's so self-evident it almost doesn't need to be asked. But
okay, so that perspective, when you see that, what's starting to break up this model now, ironically, is the media itself. Shows like this. Whether you're someone that's Joe Rogan with a podcast, or Ben Shapiro, or Pod Save America, or whatever direction you want to go to provide an outlet, at the end of the day, what you're really seeing is how these things are starting to fracture. Now, is it enough to move into their voting blocks? I don't know. But the days of coming home and watching the news at 6 p.m. are over. So when CNN puts out something that frames Tara Reade in perspective A, and Fox News comes out and frames it in perspective B, why are they doing that? Is it because they're trying to fundamentally change the difference perspective of the story, or are they just trying to map onto their audience? And lastly, I'd end with this. From a statistical perspective, when you look at something like Fox News that has been wildly dominant in the cable news network for years, I mean, it's just unheard of. I don't know, it was like 70 quarters or something. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It was like 18 years worth or something.
Yeah.
Well, is that dominance or is that mathematics? If there are 14 left-leaning stations that are all producing shows, and kind of one network that's really on the mainstream providing perspective from a conservative perspective, is it really that the narrative is so much better? Is it really that the producers are so much better? Or is it legitimately just that is an outlet for those people to go to?
So it's less. So your
concludes the
question
point.
is,
Which
yeah,
concludes the point. People, whether people trust the media or not is irrelevant. They use it.
right. So I think that's a really keen observation because you're with. It isn't that Fox News necessarily is giving people more of what they want in so much as if there's going to be that striation, right? It's there's so the those who want left-leaning news, they have so many more options to choose from. They're broken up amongst the multiple outlets, whereas with basically you're down to Fox, and there's a few up and comers now, but it's traditionally been very concentrated. So those looking for that particular bent is they have fewer options, and so I think that's a very keen observation. And so let's take this step back here. What we've sort of dealt with it so far in sort of kind of superficial ways, but we've seen sort of this pattern of with Flynn. What we saw is there was something rotten in the government, but it wasn't Flynn. And the media not only missed that narrative entirely, they actually played into it, knowingly or unknowingly. They played into a narrative that we are now seeing is entirely fraudulent. Let's jump over to Tara Reade. We see how the exact same charge that was leveled against Kavanaugh, essentially they're virtually identical in every way, except that Tara Reade is the exact opposite. She clearly has more credibility. Again, we're not saying that she did that the event happened. I think my stance is the same stance I had for Kavanaugh, which is I want to see what the evidence is and then make a decision. But from the evidence that has been presented at both sides, one at least looks far more credible, and yet how she's addressed. Then we look at, like you said, with Ms. McEnany, how it's like the media, she's actually pushing back against the media by asking questions that they won't even ask of themselves. So I guess the question that I'm asking here, and I think this is sort of that next sort of evolution of this conversation, is whether it's the virus that should not be named, whether it's Flynn or any hundreds of other things. What we are seeing is a media that is far less interested with objective truth and really discovering the objective truth in so much as it is. And let me be very precise with my language here. I think absolutely they are simply trying to pay the bills. That's one thing. So if it bleeds, it leads, right? Let's give them that. But I think there is also absolutely an ideological bend, which goes back to what we were talking about manipulation at the beginning. If you're omitting evidence, if you are framing your arguments to only be looked at one way, so you're not just choosing what to look at, you're also seeing what can be seen. What then is the ultimate negative of that? Is it that we are? Is it just that we're ill-informed, or are we deliberately malinformed? And where does that lead us?
Well, I think it raises a great question, right? Who credibly determines the credibility of a story? Who is the person in charge of being able to say that this story is accurate? The concept of fact checking, right? We're talking about Facebook now and other places that are Twitter that are using their own channels to mitigate and manage what is considered credible.
Mm-hmm.
That alone, we go back to that framing perspective, and you said what are some of those what's that feedback? What's the negative impact? The people don't trust the media anymore. It's a vicious cycle. That's what it is. Many times I'll hear someone say something and the first thought in my mind is, what source did they get that from? I don't know that I thought that my whole life. I'll leave it at that. I don't really have a date in mind as to when I started doing that, for a while, when you study this on an undergraduate or graduate level or whatever, theoretical level, or from a studies perspective, whatever, even in the industry itself, when you see things at play. But at the end of the day, you want to talk about what's lost. That's what's lost. And again, fake news to me is not Thursday was 72 degrees and it was cloudy. Oh, wait, never mind. Thursday was 78 degrees and it was sunny. That's not fake news. It's the deliberate framing of stories, the deliberate shifting of people putting out narratives with just entire fact patterns that are lost. And now, at the age of Photoshop and different perspectives that we have, I mean, you've got people now that can put out things of people in profits or that never happened.
Hold on. You need to kind of restate that, because while you were discussing about how technology has made it almost, has altered our perception. Our perception of you was completely altered as you went almost max headroom on us. So
okay. Sorry. Utilizing a lot of the tools and technology we have nowadays, we have to be, as we are capable of possessing the ability to, with deep fakes and all different types of stuff, to literally post pictures of people in places they never were. And when you apply that to campaigns, and there's a story out there about how people are using posting pictures with candidates wearing clothing and offensive shirts. Unfortunately, the never happened. So you've got people, and that's nothing new. I mean, I remember in graduate school talking about this with a professor, and Stalin used to have people removed from photos. Nero used to have people's faces taken off the side of buildings. I mean, like you can shift a narrative when you do something, altering pictures and changing pictures, and the concept, there are those that are purists out there that would say the concept of editing photo. And I don't mean editing Photoshop. I mean like cropping, like expanding, blowing the photo up. Does it say something different? And there are those that would say, if you point and shoot a picture, and then in any way alter that picture, color, focus, perspective, depth, whatever, you are altering reality. And in so doing, are you violating the integrity of that shot? We now possess technology that you can scope them out on YouTube. There's videos everywhere with deep fakes where people are literally turning into other people, and you can see it happen. And not only that, that just further works to undermine things that you asked the question before. What's the kickback to it? People have lost faith in the media. And what they've done to reassure that faith is they've found people to go reinforce those previously conceived, I wouldn't say bias. Bias seems to have a really negative connotation, but they've found ways for people, they found ways for themselves to kind of run to the hills to their own team. And people will tell them that perspective. If you don't support certain perspectives, those speakers aren't going to resonate with you. Some people can think Dennis Prager or Glenn Beck or Sean Hannity are the greatest orators in modern media. And other people can think that Dennis Prager the person? Or is that because it doesn't reinforce a narrative that they're seeking?
So let me first of all agree. Like the deep fakes, once that started happening, that terrifies me, because literally unless you have people there, it's almost impossible to validate whether or not something is real or not. It's insane. But let me sort of take this one step further. So what you're saying is, as the media has lost credibility because people can see, or let me rephrase this, some people see the media as being manipulative, as they recognize it, and so they head towards the hills. They are seeking out information that's already feeding into their preconceived notions. But then the reverse is true. The people who do buy the media narratives, hook, line, and sinker, they themselves are actually repelling, or they're rejecting anything that would contradict that narrative, and so they push even deeper into their camps. So it seems like instead of there being, hey, we have multiple perspectives here, let's take a look at this. What we're doing is we're tribalizing. And it's making both sides weaker, because instead of, as one of those famous speech about the military industrial complex, only being defeated by a knowledgeable citizenry. What we've actually done is that our media has created a vastly not just less informed uh, citizenry. We're actually we're becoming deliberately malinformed. It seems like that seems to be the sort of the overall warning here, is that as we lose that media honesty and credibility, we lose knowledgeable citizenry.
Well, I mean, there's a theme that, we've talked about before, knowledgeable citizenry. And I think that it comes down to human nature, right? I mean, you seek out information that's going to make you feel better. If you want to see how an election is going and you're voting from one side, you're going to follow channels that are going to more likely cover that side favorably. What you said before that was very striking is the concept of accountability. It appears as though, and again, on this show, we try to make sure for our listeners out there that we provide a down the middle, balls and strikes kind of perspective on what we're doing. We're not here to push in either direction, but rather to use the facts themselves to provide the points that we're trying to talk about. When we watched coverage as a country of the 2016 election, when the night started, I mean, it was a slam dunk. It was over. Everyone was going to be in bed by 7 o'clock. And some other channels covered it differently and said, well, wait a minute, that's not necessarily the case. Now, were those reporters better? Did they just happen to be on the winning side of what happened, so they look like they were more prepared because everyone's probably guessing anyway? I think at the end of the day, in our attempt to want to seek out to feel better, because we're just inundated with news all the time. I personally don't think there's 24 hours, 7 days a week news, even in this entire world, that is necessarily topical and prevalent to people in certain communities. And I mean that even on a state level. There are things happening in Dallas or California or Maine, or I'm not sure why I picked a city, but we'll say Texas, Dallas as opposed to Midland, as opposed to Odessa, as opposed to Brownsville, that necessarily are as topical. And you want to stretch that out over an entire country and now over a global perspective. Again, when you look at the quality of media production out there, it seems a lot more like these days people are much more driven by wanting to be there first rather than being there correctly. And that's dangerous. Now, I will say this, it does seem like one side of the coin, and I'll leave it to our listeners to determine what they think. It does seem like one side of the coin possesses an ability to kind of say whatever they want and then never have to walk it back. And then they can be covered by other outlets to say that, well, what they said was this, and it's this, and it's this. Let's tie this specifically to Tara Reade. I'm old enough to remember when the shouting, screamings of the world were about believing all women and just believing all credible people in stories, right? That seems to have changed now. And it's gone as far, and I will give an example on this, not from a political perspective, but from just a historical what has happened. When this, it's easy to just say a person to say, well, this is over. Okay, that's their opinion. When that opinion is coming from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, it's no longer just an opinion from some citizen. It's framing a perspective. And it's what takes an entire party and puts it in there. Again, how many of our friends that are listening who may identify on the left or as a Democrat or progressive, wherever they are saying, no, that's not what I feel. I want there to be an extensive interview and investigation. But it's almost not allowed to happen because it's like, when you come over, here are the credible talking points.
Right.
And that's where you get that tribalism. That's where people seek out comfort in the media. And that's where they are getting farther and farther away. Again, to your point, what is the end game? You lose confidence in the media. That's dangerous. And I also think it's because, as we've talked about, that injection of technology. Every person out there with an iPhone can literally snap video footage, type up a story, post it somewhere, and get 50,000 views in 30 minutes. One of the first stories that demonstrated the power of that citizen journalism / Twitter, social media based streaming, whatever you want to call it, was the miracle on the Hudson when Captain Sully landed the aircraft. You saw that footage. That wasn't covered by some news crew initially. It was covered by local people on phones. So again, we've got to make sure that in this ever-changing environment, that who has control of these stories. Let me turn a question to you. Who has control, in your opinion, over the perspective of Tara Reade? Do you look at it as DNC? Do you look at it as CNN? Do you look at it as the media writ large? Do you look at it as Joe Biden personally? Do you look at it as Tara Reade personally? Who's control? Like, who are these people? That's my question. Who is controlling this?
You know what? That's a great question. You know what? That's not necessarily what I was prepared to answer, but I think it actually very much ties into what I was about to ask. So I would ask that, or I would respond to that firstly by saying I don't think there's. And again, I'm not really big into grand conspiracies that require people to control everything, because I just don't see that humans are smart enough to pull that off, right? I can't even get my McDonald's order correctly, and you're telling me that there's some all-knowing, all-powerful group that controls everything. I don't think that's the case. But what I do think is that I think most of what we would consider to be quote-unquote conspiratorial is out in the open, right? It's more about the idea of public secrets, things that we choose to ignore. And I'll illustrate it this way. Prior to the Weinstein event, if you had asked anybody, ever, the average American, do you believe the casting couch? Do you think that that's what's happening? That young women are going in and directors and producers are sexually assaulting them, right? Like, it's not, they're not, it's more of a, hey, if you want this part, I get a, this is just going to have to happen. I think everyone in the country would have said, yeah, we've heard of the casting couch. We know that's a real thing. And yet, nothing happened. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody said anything about it. And then finally, there's this break, and we find out about Weinstein, right? And then we find out it's not just that literally everyone in Hollywood knew about it, but literally everyone sort of knew about it, and they kind of just turned a blind eye to it. Then we find out about Epstein, right? The most stunning thing to be publicly said by people with credibility was Cindy McCain, Senator McCain's wife or widow. She said everyone knew about Epstein, everyone, but no one was willing to do anything about it. And it's clear that he had very high up and very powerful friends. But the question becomes, was it simply because of blackmail, or was it just that everyone was in on it? It's sort of like, in many ways, we have a news media that knowingly, again, with that tape that broke where, I forget the name of the reporter, but she was like, I had all this years ago. And the station, who I think it was ABC that she was working for, killed it, right? We know the Weinstein story was originally killed multiple times. Ronan Farrow confirmed it. It does seem like it's not this sort of necessarily a secretive one person controlling everything, but it seems like there are open conspiracies that everyone sort of knows about, but nobody wants to do anything about because the right people benefit from it. And so I think the question becomes, is it the right people, or maybe is it the right ideology? Right? So it's more about the service of an idea. And if everyone agrees with an idea, then you don't need to have necessarily a centralized power. It's just everyone's already coming from that perspective. For example, if it's like with the mob, everybody kind of knows what the score is. So they don't necessarily always have to say how to address something. They're just going to come at it from that perspective, and you know what the response to any given stimuli would be. In the same way, I think what we have is a media, and definitely the Democratic Party, but then also partially many aspects of the Republican Party that have a particular ideology, right? And even if there are minor differences, I do think there are overriding factors, and they all play into that. And so they're all happy to sort of play into a particular narrative. And so the media plays with it because they agree with that narrative. Maybe it's a goal. I don't know. I'm not 100%. I think I don't. Again, I don't. I think there may be a goal more than narrative that they agree with. But I think it's not something dark and conspiratorial. It's more of an it's an ideologically driven factor. I think that's a long way around the way to say I don't think there's some mustache twirling supervillain, right, in a volcano layer with one of those Sphinx cats, right? I think it's simply that there's an ideology that has emerged over the last 120 years that has a far less it's far less concerned with being morally or ethically consistent, and far less concerned with being factually consistent, and is more concerned with a particular outcome or achievement. And so it's more of the means justify, or the ends justify the means. And so anything that is seen as opposing that end is by itself the enemy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, the law of unintended consequences, right? I mean, today, just in general, what we've been talking about is how we're coming about, the things that you said before about the things that we publicly don't talk about, whether it was the casting couch or whether it was, Cindy McCain and people, this outright recognition about people like Epstein or whatever was going on. Again, I feel like we're playing ping pong here with questions back and forth. Who controls that? Let me give you an example. It seems like if you let a question just kind of sit out there and no one says anything, in some cases it's allowed to go away. I'm actually going to tie this right back to General Flynn.
Yeah.
It seemed like General Flynn, there was this question raised, and it was just this immediate hysteria about Russia at that time. And we was getting, going after Sessions and going after Flynn. And slowly over time, as the information came out, people just saw that there was nothing there. And then it ended with that trial before the committee. And it was almost hard to watch.
Right.
Because you saw this very good man who dedicated decades of service to our country. And it was almost like he was being beaten up by the very people that set him out to do this, because he was holding true to the laws that he felt, that's not in the purview of my investigation. He must have said that 35 times, right? But with Flynn, you noticed it was nothing. It was off the beaten path, and then it was done, and then he was gone, and then it was trial, and then it was Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels and Michael Avenatti. It was just this overwhelming. Well, now as we're unpacking it step by step by step by step, we're seeing how much of it is there. What I heard somebody say once is that the objective was very clear. It was to cast a shadow over the presidency for 4 years, and they did. They found ways to do it, whether it was fighting against the wall, fighting against Flynn, with Mueller, with whatever. It was designed to do it. So we talk about these public things out in public. Yeah, we just say that they're there, and we know that they're there, and we're kind of almost okay with it because we're like, oh, silly politicians.
No, exactly. No, I think that's a great
when does that become okay? So again, the flip side is that, like, I mean, whether it was Hillary Clinton's emails or something going on, I mean, you even have people out there quoting someone like, the chairman of the DNC going out there, Tom President, saying, this is the new emails. Is it? Because I guarantee you, if she were claiming this against Senator Tom Cotton or Vice President Pence, I think it would be carried differently.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
Which comes back to the question that I'm going to come back to. Who has that power? Who does that?
You know what?
Because it seems like on one side, no stories are ever allowed to drop until you so overwhelmingly show what it is, which is what I think the end game was at the end, to drag out and to delay. setting up committee after committee after committee after committee to go through for impeachment, setting up committee after committee after committee after committee to see what's going on with coronavirus. I'm more fascinated to see the amount of times that I hear certain people accusing the United States before I see them holding other parties that are actually, in fact, responsible.
You know what? I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to come out. Let me just come out and say it, because you're asking the right question. And at first, and while my argument that I don't believe there's one person who can control everything, and I do agree to that, I do think maybe I was sort of unintentionally skirting an answer here. And I think we've already been told what that answer is. It is we today call it the deep state, but back in the day, he called, again, we just talked about the knowledgeable citizenry. It is the military industrial complex. It is the permanent aspect of our government. The thing that sort of is, again, what we call the deep state. It's like that group of people who profit off of the government more and its governmental action. So I would argue that maybe that's the secret. That's the secret that we can't talk about. That's the secret we can't discuss, right? Is a senator goes in being worth maybe, okay, let's face it, most of them were rich to begin with, but let's say they're higher middle class. I mean, they're making a couple $100,000 a year. They go in, they come out being worth $20 million. Well, that sure as the hell didn't happen accidentally. And it's both sides, right? There's people talk about, draining the swamp. No. Washington is absolutely a swamp. There, again, Virginia, we're just outside. The counties in Virginia where most people who work in Washington live are literally in the I think it was like the top 5 or 6 of the most wealthy counties in the United States are in Virginia, right there where they live, because that's where all the lobbyists go. And everyone's like, "Oh, corporations are buying politicians." It's more incestuous than that. It's the government itself. It imposes winners and losers based on who's going to pay them the most, right? We've been pretty much, forget 9/11. We've been pretty much perpetually at war since North Korea, definitely since Vietnam. Sure, we may not have had necessarily one big military action like we did with Desert Storm or in the initial days of the war on terrorism, but it's not like we had ever not been bombing people or not sending troops somewhere to quote unquote clean something up, right? It's not like we had ever stopped producing weapons for some other nation to build. We are the number one arms dealer on the planet, period. End of story. There, a lot of the things that Trump has been complaining about that sort of gets mentioned, but then when he makes these trade deals, like, oh, it's whatever. The trade deals, look at how lopsided many of these trade deals with these other nations are. They were very favorable to nations like China, right? And what happens? We send people there, they come out, and I think Biden's a great example. Let's just look at what happened with Biden and Hunter, right? They go over, and Biden is supposed to be negotiating some trade deals. He comes back, and his son is flying on the same aircraft with him. He's taking all the same meetings, and somehow Biden walks away with a multi-billion-dollar contract from China. How does that work? How does no one look at that and be like, "Whoa, wait, that's not legit"? But the reason they don't do it is because all the other major players in Washington are doing it. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They're all doing it. So I think the ultimate answer here is the ideology that I mentioned at the beginning is statism. It is a firmly entrenched operational state that controls enough of the economy to do what it needs to do. The more power, the better, because then they get to determine who gets what contracts and what money gets spent where. It's the ability to control the purse of the largest economy that's ever existed. That's the goal. And who benefits? It's the deep state. It's those who make money off of the government. Most of them are people we will never see or hear about, but the ones we do see and hear about it, we see them, we see their corruption. It's in our face all the time, and yet we never call them on it. They maintain. We have the same problems that we had 30, 40 years ago. Our roads aren't any better. Our roads aren't any better maintained, and yet we keep spending trillions of dollars on quote unquote shovel ready projects. I'm sorry, but we spent trillions of dollars. I don't see anybody with any damn shovels. Do you? That's your answer. For me, I think that's your answer. I think it's the ideology of a statism, and who has the power? It's the people within the deep state, which is the military industrial complex. It's everything from why we have spent the last 50 years fighting in every godforsaken hellhole that we can find, and still supplying weapons and arms to every dictator we can shake hands with, and at the same time our roads are being destroyed, our infrastructure is destroyed, yet we keep throwing money at shovel-ready projects, and the politicians keep getting richer. I think that's your answer right there. Anything that opposes that goal is what's driving the narrative. Don't ask questions you don't want answers for, man.
Yeah, I mean, it can be right. Yeah, no, I'll tell you what. The irony again of the technology working for us here. You sounded a bit like Megatron a couple times, but it was actually kind of dramatic, and I liked it actually. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that again, we can deep dive on a lot of those subjects and find all types of solutions or answers, we'll call it, maybe not solutions, but to who we think is pushing those. I mean, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So at the end of the day, I think what we're looking at is how does the instrument, I mean, today we're talking about, the media with regard to specific cases that we cited. How does this instrument, which can be used, I think, in many good ways. I mean, there are many. Look what we're doing right now. We're maintaining a conversation and chronicling it for posterity here, if you will, on media platforms. I do not think the media is bad. I do not think the media is this. The media is a tool, and like any tool, it will turn into what it's used for. It can be used as a weapon. It can be used as an instrument for human perseverance. I think that it's about whose hands do we trust placing that power, that megaphone into? And are those the people, which is why you have to be careful when you look at certain people that hold such exquisite power over certain social media platforms. They can almost unilaterally change things. That's a really, really careful place to be. I mean, if you want to talk about people that I think we're talking about specific to holding power, I do think that there are people out there that would probably agree to the point that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or people like that in those realms have reach. I'm not explaining whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm simply saying, factually speaking, they have reach through their companies, and those companies can take positions. The fundamental question that you've always seen in the debates, I'll use Twitter just because it's out there if people want to Google it and see the information on it. But, it's that concept of, are you a platform or are you a publisher? Because depending upon where you fall into that realm, it kind of supports what authorities you have when it comes to, we'll say, crafting and framing speech on your websites. There's certain, you'll see reporters that'll go on shows. Tim Pool was recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he spoke about, the mere mentioning of certain people's names will get shows defunded or deplatformed on certain other media outlets. That's scary.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, it's a similar line, and I don't want to get too far off on it. I was just listening to, just before we came on the show, a little segment. I just forgot his name, but he had a thought about it starts off as Law and Order, but he argues that there's different. This kind of goes back to something you mentioned earlier about sort of the strategy, people looking for what they want. But he says, if you look at the Western the basic narrative is there's no law, but one man one man rises up to overcome the chaos and brings order to that. And then he says, but then he calls it what's called the Northern, which is law and order, which is that there is institutionalized law and it's always good and it's always active. But then, and then he has the Eastern, which is there is institutionalized. There's an institution that is good, but it's been corrupted from within. And then you have the Southern, where it's the institution is entirely corrupt, and it's an outsider who brings justice to it. And as you said, there is that, and that's a concept I think we need to explore in another show more fully. But I think that the point that you're mentioning here is we have people with this power to control everything. Literally, it's like that you see in here. It's like the old Outer Limits opening. Literally everything you see in here can be controlled by 2 or 3 people. And what they seem to be doing, outside of removing things they don't want seen, is that they are like whichever perspective you want, whether you're a Western or a Southern or a Northern or an Eastern, they are sending you only the information that feeds into that worldview, right? It's like those stories are basically are Rorschach tests of how you view the world. And it's like, it's not just that they're removing things they don't want you to see. They're only giving you things that are sort of reinforcing that worldview individually. But then you have the other, the old school media, the traditional media, which is creating a narrative itself. And there's the competition, but what it's doing is it's serving to create more tribalism, to create deeper, even deeper divides than what already natively existed. I'm hoping you found a point in that whole spiel, because I don't know that I did. And I think we lost Nick again. Well, since the Gremlins have decided that Nick is gone, I do happen to see that we're at the hour mark. So I guess we will go ahead and call it an episode. And a heck of an episode it's been. I did not anticipate it really going this direction. When we initially sat down to,
I think we're having a little technical difficulty on this end, so I'm not sure if our listeners are experiencing the same thing.
Okay, can you hear me? Nick's back. Nick, can you hear me? I guess he still can't hear me. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Long story short is, we have a media that...
Are you there?
I am. Hold on. I'm just going to text him real quick, guys. This is going to be fun.
Are you there?
Theater of the Mind. Hold on.
I'm right here. Can you hear me?
I'm texting him to let him know that I can hear him. So I've let him know that I was here, that he can't hear me.
Here.
But I can hear
you perfectly clearly.
Oh, you can hear me.
That's it. I went rogue there for a little bit.
There you are. Well, wonderful. Okay, so there we go. 21st century. It's a beautiful time. So as I mentioned, we're already at the hour mark, and it seems like the Gremlins are getting tired of us. Maybe the deep state has heard us talk a little too long, and they're like, okay, we can't have this. I think
the feedback's getting pretty bad on this side. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but something's kicking up in the way.
All right. Well, let's just go ahead and wrap it up, and just say this, guys. We'll see you next time. It just sounds like we need to be more conscious citizens, more conscious consumers of information.
I can't. You're coming through broken up.
Don't always believe what you hear, people. Well, next time we'll have some working mics. We'll talk at y'all later. Bye.